and we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us today. So the purpose of the Learning Communities Resource Center is to analyze community action outcomes and identify effective, promising, and innovative practice models to alleviate the causes and conditions of this is of critical importance because anti-poverty work is at the heart of what we do. That's what grounds us in our work and what brings us into our respective offices every day is to help better the communities that we serve around the country. And in that same mindset, we'd like to begin all of our events by reciting the promise of community action, which states that community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. So I'm seeing that a lot of you are sending into the chat that there's some static. I am so sorry. I apologize for that. I'll speed through my intro, and I'll call back in so we can get that scratching out. We do apologize for those technical issues. So I will go ahead and skip through. But today's webinar event is going to be the continuation of our poverty trends learning community. And with the Futures Project, they are zeroing in on building, creating, and administering a local theory of change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over into the very capable hands of our presenter for today, Kim Tully. Kim, you're on. Thanks.
I'd like to thank you, first of all, for coming on board with me to go through and listen more about the Futures Project. Today we're going to go through and, let's see, next slide. I'm also happy to announce that I'm acting as the facilitator and the trainer for the Futures Project as part of the infrastructure design of continuing on the work. The position that I'm in came available in at the end of August, and it's to help facilitate and expand the use of futures in our region and beyond that. Next slide. So I was going to give you in this webinar more of the backstory about how the Futures Project came from, where it came from, and the basis behind it, but then also go and talk through some of the experience of the pilot. I was involved in the first cohort for the pilot, which included 6 different community action agencies within Region 10, and go through the process of talking about that a little bit, and then the lessons learned out of that experience. We're in the process of developing and recruiting for a second cohort, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then also, we plan to share with you many of the tools and documents that we developed over the course of the project, not only the administrative side of it, but for the community action agencies themselves to use on the ground. And so we're going to talk through that, and I can show you where that is available for you going forward. Next slide. Actually, one more slide. So just to go back a little bit and talk about how Futures was developed, the state of Washington and the CAP agencies themselves, in the course of actually implementing ROMA and ROMA quality assurance model, started talking about how hard it was for us to succinctly sort of talk about our story, about who we are and what we do and how we bring valuable to our community. And so we wanted to try to create something that had some consistency over the region, and at least specifically with the 30 CAP agencies in Washington State. And so we wanted it also to be able to be some kind of consistent message to the stakeholders in the audience that we know that we have, funders and stakeholders, our staff ourselves, and the clients we serve. Next slide. So we historically had all been working from, I think, sort of an independent process of trying to describe how we as a community action agency work to eliminate poverty how we provide, and then we would sort of list off a number of services that we provide, housing, shelter, weatherization, etc., to try to identify and help that person understand how we were working to address and eliminate poverty. But we often told it in ways in which it was not connected to even other community action agencies in our in counties or other providers that we work with. So we struggled to see that it was compelling in and of itself. Next slide. So what we tried to do is to say, how can we actually ground ourselves collectively in the state around creating tools and ways in which we communicate that are engaging and relatable to the general public, related to those other stakeholders, whether they were funders, elected officials, etc. And we started to think about, well, how are we going to, if we were to sort of etch-a-sketch this and like flip it over, shake it really hard, and flip it back and say, how would we start this, and how do we start with the why versus the end result of eliminating poverty? And so I wanted to show this YouTube because it was part of the way in which we began to change our thinking. So we can go ahead and play the video.
His client, you know, we always
And just as a reminder for folks as we near the end of the video, please make sure to pause or mute it before you close the tab when the video is done. Thanks.
So where do you start when you have a program? So where do you start when you have a program that's about integrating life? Well, you start with why. And that.
So this is a reminder to everybody, you got to make sure to mute that video window or pause it or whatever before we go forward, because it's going to keep playing throughout the presentation. So please make sure to close it before you close that multimedia viewer window.
For example, why is Apple so innovative? Why is Apple here? The only orator of the day. Why him? And why is it that the my brothers beat them to it? 3.5 ago, I made it.
So it looks like Kim is having some issues with her audio. We'll give her just a second to get reconnected. Please stand by, everyone. We apologize for the inconvenience.
Hello?
Very, very few people or organizations
Hi,
know why.
Kim. I think you're still playing in the back. Might want to mute it.
By why, I mean what's your purpose?
I'm trying to know how to do that.
Why did your organization?
If you go back to that tab, you either have to pause it or mute the video before you close the tab.
From the outside in, it's obviously the clear, but the inspired leaders, the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry,
I'm looking.
inside out. Want to buy one?
All right, Kim, please stand by.
And then All I did was reverse the order of the information. People don't buy what you do. People buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. This explains why every single person in this room is perfectly comfortable buying a computer from Apple. But we're also perfectly
Cam, are you still there?
I'm still here, and I cannot get it to go off. I apologize.
But as I said,
it's okay. What I would recommend doing is disconnecting the audio from your computer, and please try calling in webinar through the phone using the information on the Quick Start tab.
They're qualified to make flat screen TVs.
We apologize for the technical difficulties, everyone, but we promise this is all part of the presentation. Please give Kim just a couple of minutes to get sorted out with her audio. We do, again, sincerely apologize, and we will be right back with you shortly. We promise it's going to be worth the wait, so please stick around. Thanks.
Hello?
Kim, are you there?
Hello?
Kim?
What in the... Hello?
All right, Kim, are you back with us?
You know I am. Thank you for all of your patience there.
Of course, no problem. We sincerely apologize. And thank you, Kim, for being so quick on your feet. I was telling everyone in your absence, this is all part of the presentation, right? This all has to do with building a local change.
There you go. There we go.
Right,
so we're on to the next slide, right?
Yes, go ahead.
So hopefully the message of that video is that we we took on the challenge of trying to re-message ourselves by starting a process together to really concentrate it on the why of why we do what we do, so that we can convey our message differently. And so as an example here, you know, we provide 300 units of housing. We're used to just sort of rifling off a lot of the outputs that we do as agencies, but not necessarily creating an outcome. In the new messaging, we tried to create the basis of outcomes. So we believe everyone should have a safe, affordable place to live, et cetera, and sort of converting our messaging. Next slide. So we started off with that, and I have to say it was challenging. It was very hard for people to get together in the room and say, okay, what is then the outcome? What is the why? Not pulling apart our contractual requirements we had, but trying to make sure that we were really looking at that conversion to outcomes in the community and outcomes in the clients' lives. And so here's some of the ways in which we changed the way we were talking about what we do. Next slide, what we believe. And this sort of led us through a process with determining at a regional level what is our theory of change, and breaking it actually apart, which in and of itself was quite a discussion, but breaking it into what is it that we do in our communities in regards to helping individuals and families, and how do we then, on a secondary level, how do we impact the health of our community? So we went through the process of looking at the verbiage we were using, and to be honest, the goal of eliminating poverty is quite vast and lofty and very difficult to measure. And so we started to look at, well, how would we actually be able to measure this type of success? So we looked at it from a standpoint of stabilizing people in the community and meeting their basic needs and progressing our services towards being able to equip people to exit poverty. And that change in framework was critical for us to figure how we might then go forward and start to measure what we are doing on the level of individual service. And so this theory of change is reflective of Region 10, and we started to use framework that we paid for some research to be done by Oregon State University, and we'll go into that a little bit later, but it came into this framework. Next slide. And so Washington State went through this process and decided that they would look at it from the purposes of sharing it. And when we did so, we determined that Region 10 wanted to do a more formal process and adopt this as a way to go. And so we started to involve the community action agencies in Oregon, who not only accepted the idea but brought on this research from Oregon State University. And then also Idaho also agreed to accept the framework under that theory of change model, and they themselves had just gone through a process of creating a software system for CAP agencies for the entire state of Idaho, and they offered to extend that knowledge that they'd acquired through that into this relationship. Next slide. So we went through a collaboration process from just a state of 30, but a state of 30 CAP agencies to a regional effort, and which is represented in 53 CAP agencies. We agreed to go through a process of creating a memorandum of understanding with each other, and we knew that that might go a little slower in order to try to put that kind of framework together on such a large level with the idiosyncrasies, of each state and the way in which their CAP CAP agencies are organized, but we also knew that we would expand the impact of using it and that we might be able to validate the work that we're doing on a larger level, and that we could sort of make sure we were sharing all of that investment that we were doing together on a grander scale. Next slide. So just to kind of put it in perspective, we started this process in 2014 with trying to create the value for the project. We invited the other states to do so, and they shared in, and we created a steering committee, which was comprised of the representatives from each state that process and accepts the SBG funds, the executive director leadership of the CAP association of each state, and also the overarching agreement at the Region 10 level. We went through the process of refining and adapting that theory of change that you saw, and accepting the Oregon State research project that was done, and also going through the process of hiring a coordinating entity that would manage the regional project throughout the 3 states, which was the Prosperity Agenda. And then also going through the process of now breaking down into some work groups, going through the process of testing through the pilot project the indicators that were created, and then also going through and adopting the approach of a community, a learning community, so that we can keep the project evolving and the criteria of the curriculum of the online training program that's been created consistently and growing as well. Next slide. So, you know, it's almost been 3 years, and the lessons learned have been that it was good to go through the process from a partnership standpoint and a collaborative standpoint to go through those conversations that created the MOU in order for us to now sort of start to really be moving the piloting process. That we created a communication, one of those work groups is a communications work group, and that continuously going through that process of feedback around how it is to implement the Futures project, and then also how the steering committee can support the piloting process, et cetera, all been valuable lessons to really implement this deeply within geographical area. Next slide. Next, go ahead. So when we went through the process of really looking at this remessaging and really moving ourselves from sort of being output-driven in the way we communicate what we do to being part of a continual learning approach and really focusing on outcomes of what's happening in the community and with individual people when it comes to the work that we do, we looked at it and we said, well, you know, we collect a lot of data. We're not short on the collection of data. And most of it has been based historically on funder-driven outputs or outcomes. And so when we looked at that and thought, well, what would actually be a valuable tool to help us make that movement? Next slide. We wanted to make sure that we included within it to make sure we were anchoring ourselves in the theory of change, because that's what we were really seeking, is how do we move forward towards outcomes and speak differently but stay consistent to this theory of change that we worked very hard together to construct. And it was to make sure that what we were doing, we would be doing it based upon something that was validated as a best practice and research, and that what we were actually then trying to measure was measurable. versus that vast goal of eliminating poverty, for instance, and that we end up then with proven programs from all of that consensus. Next slide. You know, and we also thought, well, we need to make sure that we're sticking authentically to what we had constructed that theory of change around, when we really had gone back to the why do we do what we do. One of the, of course, primary goals of community action is that we work to change the attitudes and the practices of communities towards the poor. And that we worked, we decided on the stabilizing and equipping strategies in order to try to really approach how we look at helping people equip themselves out of poverty. And then we wanted to make sure that what we were doing was converting the information that we had, which were a lot of outputs, into the type of decision-making we could make that had strategy to it, that was from looking at outcomes, and try to move away, again, from that transactional, you know, we serve 500 people, or we had X number of bus rides, et cetera, to more of a goal-oriented model towards the relationships with our clients and how we were meeting their needs. Next slide. And so all of that sort of tied together per se, a futures theory of change, which was that we wanted to make sure, again, we were addressing the guidelines around individuals and families as a community action agency, both in, you know, in our work that we do, but also in the NPIs and the way in which we were reporting what we did, and also trying to make sure that we had some type of a helpful framework in understanding our outcomes and trying to test them in some ways in which we were consistently doing that across the region, and also that it would help individual agencies as well as groups of agencies tell their story in a more compelling fashion. So next slide. So we started actually going from theory and movement of planning to implementing, and we went through a process of identifying 6 agencies, community action agencies, that would go through the process of sort of testing the work that was created in the futures around creating a learning community and around the work and the research that had come out of Oregon State. And so I actually represented Solid Ground, went through that pilot process, and the other sites were selected both on trying to ensure that all the states were included in the process, and that we had some urban areas and rural emphasized community action agencies involved, so that there was a richness in the cohort. Next slide. And we went through a process that was designed. The steering committee and the prosperity agenda went through the process of partnering with a group called Global Learning Partners, and really emphasizing and creating learning tools that were around adult learning, and the emphasis of how most adult learning includes on-the-job type training and active use of knowledge. So there was a lot of ways to interact with the information and each other. And we went through a 6-week process of going through a curriculum that was online, and we were all a cohort. Many of us had 2 or 3 people on our team, so the group was about 35, I believe, of individuals that represented these 6 agencies. And it was critical that we all went through a process of ensuring that we, as a learning community, had people who were in the organization closest to client service directly, so case managers or housing counselors, people doing direct interaction with clients, and then those that supervise them, to ensure that we were creating some diversity in the way that we were looking at the information. Next slide. And we focused specifically on the areas of converting data that we collect and information that we know into how we would use that as a basis for decision making and the ways in which we could do strategy within the organization to make those decisions. So that was really the focus of cohort 1. Next slide. And so as many of us have had and known, moving and converting from being out-based driven or transactionally focused to being more relationship or goal-oriented focused specifically for individuals and families is kind of a, I don't want to say volcanic process, but it's kind of a, it has some upheaval to it and some ways in which we are trying to move and identify change, whether it's change of circumstance, change over time, change of status, etc. And so we had gone through that process individually as sites, and then we went through the process of trying to ensure that we were measurably counting the ways in which different things and change can be identified. And that was an area of focus by individual indicators, and it was an examination that was a conversation and dialogue that many of the people in the sites felt like they hadn't had the latitude to have, that we don't necessarily create the space for it to work. And so part of the pilot process, it was critical to try to spend time in it and trying to get ourselves mentally and otherwise from output-driven looks at how we do work to actually outcomes. Next slide. Next. So getting back a little bit to like what was the basis of some of the indicators, the work that was done by Oregon State University was actually an examination of all the CAP agencies within the state of Oregon, which many of them were rural or multi-county CAP agencies and pretty resource lean. And the challenges were around trying to identify from research what really are the indicators around poverty, what are the things that keep people generationally in poverty, and what are the types of indicators that we would be looking at if we were trying to actually determine whether we were making change or helping them make their own change in those areas. And so we were asked to look at those and whether those fit within the work that we did. And so the 13 dimensions of poverty became and has become the platform for the Region 10 CAP agencies. Next slide. And so I just did this exercise actually with my agency. We had gotten into a full leadership meeting with supervisors and managers and directors of a relatively diverse CAP agency. We have about 25 programs across many aspects. And when we went through the conversation of saying, you know, what are the areas in people's lives in which they have challenge and which we see supports and services necessary to help them. And when we went through and brainstormed, it was interesting that many of them surfaced under these 13 dimensions. And many of them were linked to these social networks and connections, and one called Growth Mindset, which we'll talk about in a minute. But these are the 13 areas and dimensions that were found in the research by Oregon State. Next slide. And so for each one, we went through the process as an organization and talked about, you know, the individual dimensions, and then sort of backing into, you know, well, what would those outcomes look like? Not necessarily outputs, but what are the outcomes we're looking for? Say, for instance, you look at housing. The dimensions in 13 dimensions of poverty around housing are actually exactly the same as are in our NPIs. And so when we looked at it, and outcomes had to do with whether people were obtaining or retaining permanent housing, or whether they were able to maintain housing or certain rent levels. We sat with that department and talked through, what are the indicators of whether someone's actually meeting those outcome measurements, and then what information or data might we need to collect. And what's interesting is that many of the people in different aspects of the organization really understand these individual components. And as you might guess, the people who are closest to the intake or closest to the client know more specifically the exact data or demographic data or income data that we collect. And that somewhere between that and the supervisory level, or the way in which that's pulled over multiple case managers or multiple housing, start to give us an indication of what those elements are as to whether people are meeting outcomes. And when you sit in the room with the learning community approach, and you start to see the case manager sitting with the director, sitting with the ED, at that higher level of talking about housing, the richness of the examination of the information is pretty heightened. Next slide. So when we were looking at how would we sort of test out this diverse learning community approach to examining information and changing or converting data into the ways in which we would improve program or talk about the program, we looked at sort of where that common space was. And like I said, the 13 dimensions of poverty have some indicators that are exactly the same as our national performance indicators. And so since we were trying to look at a different way of doing business, we stuck to some of the data that we already collect and that we knew we actually had that data together. And so I think there's 19 indicators that are exactly the same, and they're in housing and employment and education and income. And so the Futures first cohort focused on sort of known data, but looking at it in a different way. Next slide. And so part of the learning community approach, which I actually, as a person who does evaluation and reporting and compliance for contracts myself, I enjoyed the fact that the learning community approach to examining data really acknowledged the fact that the quantitative data that we get out of programs is very anchoring, but it's also just part of the story. And understanding the narrative around it or the context of it, it was very easy for the people who are in the case manager supervisory role to say, we know this, but we also know that certain populations, for instance, aren't even reflected here because of the way in which either the system collects people who are eligible for service or the ways in which people struggle to become eligible for service. And then also putting together personal stories that we know on the qualitative side, where we get exit surveys and ways in which we survey the people we serve, and all of it's necessary to really be able to tell a holistic story about the way in which we're doing our work and the way in which our community is receiving our work. And that when we brought in the learning community approach, we saw these spaces in between, this ability to be explaining information to people, even ourselves collectively, to engage other people in the organization that maybe we hadn't sat with before, and to enlighten or educate, and that we know all of that has to do with the areas that can promote change, whether it's change in the way we do the service or the delivery of the service potentially, or the location we serve people from, and all of those types of things. So while the conversion of quantitative data is important, all of the other aspects of information is what our story is going to be comprised of. Next slide. So one of the areas of the research that was done was also doing interviews, sitting down in forums and open spaces with staff and listening to their challenges and concerns and their lens, per se, that they see data through and data collection and data reporting and compliance, in order to try to really understand at different levels of the organization what is that data and information being developed under. And so just within the 6 CAP agencies, there were, I believe, 35 case managers interviewed. I think there were 17 managers and 13 or 14 directors that went through a process of talking through where they saw their part of the processes around reporting and using of information that was internally being created within their agency. And so we knew, as you might think, the caseworker level, for instance, very concerned to the client in regards to the ways in which questions are asked, when they're asked, and very concerned about whether all of the effort towards obtaining data takes away from the case manager's time they spend doing problem solving and being a support system for the client, for instance. And at the manager level, it was much a collecting data and trying to make sure that it's consistently being looked at or examined, whether the context to which it's collected is the same across the organization. And at the director level, it was very much I know that we're doing really good work, I know that we're trying to meet the need, but what is the reach, and how do I know when some of the types of information I'm asked about doesn't necessarily correlate to data I'm collecting. So it was very interesting to go through that process and to ensure that we're engaging people in the learning community approach through all those levels of the organization. Next slide. So we went through the process in the Futures pilot of really trying to go from, that theoretical agreement of what we wanted to then focus on as far as the why we do the work, and really trying to figure out how do we operationalize it, how do we actually implement it in a way that you can see that we are functioning in a different way, but that we're also then examining on a different level. And so we tried to make sure that what we were doing, next slide please, is to make sure that we were including these different perspectives, the case manager, the managers, the supervisors, the program managers, the directors, and then our leadership team, our CEO, potentially our board members. Were we making sure that we were including all of those perspectives at the table of this examination? Next slide. And that this was the way that we were looking, like, again, we took housing, and so we were looking at housing data that we had originally. The MPI data is very similar to McKinney or HUD data on housing and how we're determining positive outcomes. But we were looking at it in a different way as an organization in a learning community, and asking a lot of questions. Those that are closest to it ask specific questions related to the way in which the data either eliminates people or is inclusionary or exclusionary. And many people who are not actually directly identified to housing, but were in our leadership, asked some very profound questions from the outside lens, sort of looking in. that created ways in which we had richer questions, and therefore we did some research and ended up with a deeper, I guess you would say, dose of learning around particular areas we thought we actually knew well. And so the learning occurred. We ended up with a greater amount of information to look at for the same things that we previously, I think, used the data very, a high level of concentration of our decision making was based upon collective data versus this larger conversation. Next slide. So what I would say is an emphasis around this was, I know for myself, as I'm the ROMA certified implementer for my agency, and we have gone through the process in the last couple of years around making sure that we were actually doing ROMA. We had also struggled with how do you implement it on the ground, ROMA, and how do we make sure that we're actually aligning ourselves with the work that's being done at the national level, with also the work that was being done at our community level. And we were searching for a process to actually use, a sort of best practice process that allowed us to really do the quality assurance side of the ROMA cycle to make better decisions about service and our partnerships. Who should we be partnering with and who should be at the table with us more? And so we have adopted this continuous improvement process through Futures, this learning community approach, and trying to ensure that as I've talked about, we include staff at all levels of the organization. We try to make sure that we have diverse conversations and that people's experience is included in the information, not just client data and not just collected quantitative data, but, you know, the experience of the people who work day to day in their service. And to make sure that as we're doing that, we're continually trying to make sure that we're leading ourselves through the process for the adoption of our new MPIs, and that ROMA Next Generation is also benefiting from the adoptions of our future work. Next slide. So a lot of the times when we talk about this, people say, wow, you know, this sounds like more work. And where would you find the time to do this? And I think one of the things that's been important is that we've focused on the fact that we're trying to change the way we do the existing work we do in order to approach it from that reverse, so that people instantly can see the why in what we're doing. And we found that we actually have, and most people would say they're not short of meetings. You know, we have a lot of meetings. But we made sure that we tried to just infuse 10 minutes or 15 minutes into the existing case manager meeting, for instance, or the HMIS homeless services meeting, or the managers meeting, or the leadership meeting, the board meeting. I've sort of put in a standard 10, 15-minute time block to make sure that we're getting input and that we're looking at things and talking about them, so that we're actually, people are used to that now. And they often ask me, you know, what are we talking about this meeting coming up? And so there's some excitement that comes from bringing people new pieces of information and letting them be a part of it. Next slide. So as far as the Futures project itself, we are going through the process of continually looking at the curriculum and the piloting experience to try to ensure that we're helping any additional CAPs that are going through the process to consider the use of the Futures when they are looking at their ROMA processes, looking at their new MPIs process. We're looking to grow the participation of CAP agencies in the learning community. And we're trying to continually expand information around and awareness around the Futures work and the resources that's what's in the next year's plan. And next slide. And so what you see in front of you now is the Washington Partnership WASCAP organization has on their website. We've housed our toolkit there, and so the futures information that a lot of it I went through today, like the timeline and the funding, the way in which it was funded, the way the steering committee was put together, and the lessons we've learned so far around even the administration function of the way we set it up within the region. The copy of the MOU is there, some background around the information that went into it and the agreements that were made between the states. And then the facilitator job announcement that I'm now sitting in that position, but the job description itself and what was needed or necessary is there, as well as all the access to the research and the information that I talked about around Oregon State's report, the 13 dimensions, some tools around using those individual dimensions with staff and doing some exercises, the support of our theory of change and things like that are all there for anyone who's sitting at either state association level or the state that you represent. And we have a Department of Commerce, but most states have a state agency that's the fiscal agent for their CSBG funds. And we are continuing to develop access to that toolkit and some videos and narrative around what sort of led in and out of the individual documents that we have. And then the detail around those personas, it's interesting to actually read them individually. Every time I read one, someone comes to mind who I work with and says, yeah, that sounds like this person. And then we will continually post recommendations that come from the sites themselves that participate in the Futures pilots, and continually talk from the people who are going through the experience on how to improve it. And so that is available and will continue, like I said, to be enhanced. Next slide. And so it's really wanted to have this slide that says, how can you become involved if you're interested? You can join the Poverty Trends learning community that the National Partnership has that continues to provide these kinds of access and these webinars. You can tap into the last webinar that we're going to have, which is in a couple weeks, and we'll be including more tools and more conversation around some unique ways in which different CAPs have chosen to start to integrate the learning community approach at their CAP. And if you share with different organizations, leadership, your boss, around the Futures work that's going on at Region 10, and if you're interested in joining any of our future pilots, next pilot, you can contact me. My information is at the last slide. And now I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Kim, for walking us through today's presentation. I sent it out through the chat, but I'll pause a little bit and see if anyone has any questions that they want to send in for Kim. But while you guys are typing in your questions, I know one additional resource that's on the way, because we had a conversation about it, was a toolkit that the Futures folks are going to be developing for the partnership. So I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, Kim, while we're waiting for folks to send in their questions.
Well, related to the WASCAP, what I would call sort of the documents inventory that we've created there, there will be some either narrative created or video created that talks about the individual tools, and also around how, what does it take to create a learning community, what does that environment need to look like, and those types of things as we go forward. And yes, certainly it will be available there as well as on the national website.
Great, thanks. So you guys can expect to see that in a couple weeks, so please stay tuned. have that for you soon. I'm going to do a last call for questions. Are there any more thoughts? I will let everyone know, once again, that this webinar is going to be recorded, and the slides will be made available before the end of the week, so you all will have access to that. But are there any content-related questions for Kim? All right, well, Kim, thank you so much for today's presentation. It was nice to hear from you again, and we're looking forward to your next presentation with us.
All right, well, thank you very much, and again, thanks for your patience.
Of course. Thanks, Kim. So, as Kim mentioned, our next webinar is going to be taking place on September 27th, and that's going to be the fourth and final webinar in this series with the Futures Project. And this is going to be the How Part 2, where they're going to continue to walk us through the thought process for their theory of change that they're working on up there in Region 10. So please join us for that event. You can find the registration information on the partnership's website under our webinars tab. Another upcoming event that we have, it would have been helpful to put the date on the slide, but the next upcoming webinar we have will be on September 25th, and that will be part of our Decreasing Family Homelessness Learning Community Group, which we facilitate in partnership with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and they're going to be talking about a coalition that's going on up in the Northwest on how to decrease unsheltered family homelessness. So please join us for that presentation. Again, it will be on September 25th, and we will post the registration information on our website, so you can find that there if you're interested. Also here, you can use the link on your screen to access the registration information for the September 27th presentation of the Futures Project. We very much appreciate all of your feedback, and we thank you for your participation once again in today's event. If you wouldn't mind taking just a few moments to fill out our survey, let us know how we did and how we can improve our webinar events going forward. And here is the contact information, not only for myself, but for everyone else on the Training and Technical Assistance Department here at the Partnership. Please feel free to reach out to any and all of us with any questions, concerns, or comments that you may have. We would love to hear from you. But with that, that's going to conclude our webinar presentation for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. We appreciate your patience as we were dealing with our technical issues. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Enjoy your day.